I was having coffee with a friend yesterday, smart, successful, the kind of person who seemed to have it all together. And he spent the first 20 minutes just gushing about this new partner he'd started dating. He was practically glowing, showing me their text threads, telling me how they stayed up talking until 3 a.m.
The honeymoon phase.
Totally. He insisted he had finally found someone who truly understands me. He looked like a man who had won the emotional lottery. But then the conversation took this really sharp, confusing turn. I just asked him how their date went the previous night, and the light in his eyes just vanished. He leaned back, crossed his arms, and his whole tone went completely cold.
What happened on the date?
That's the thing. Nothing bad.
Yeah.
She had simply cooked him dinner and expressed how happy she was to be with him. A normal, loving gesture. Yet his reaction was visceral. He said he felt suddenly suffocated.
Wow.
Yeah. He described this overwhelming urge to run, to ghost her, to just escape. He literally used the word repulsed by the very intimacy he had been craving just minutes before.
That's a huge switch.
It was so jarring to watch. That instantaneous shift from this desperate longing for connection to a cold, defensive wall. And it wasn't that she had done anything wrong. It was her closeness itself that triggered some kind of hidden tripwire in his mind. It made me realize that his earlier excitement, it wasn't really about her as a person, but about a fantasy. The moment reality gained too close, this ancient survival mechanism just kicked in. This contradiction desiring love, but treating it like a threat is, I think, the perfect window into the hidden software that controls our relationships. Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission today is a really deep dive into the science of adult attachment. We're focusing intensely on that foundational programming, how those crucial early experiences create these deep-seated behavioral programs.
Right.
And why simple proximity or, commitment often triggers these full-blown physiological alarm bells in otherwise rational adults. And most importantly, how individuals can actively rewrite that software.
And what you just described with your friend, that is the entire paradox of intimacy for so many people. I mean, attachment theory gives us the fundamental roadmap for understanding why that push-pull cycle even exists.
It's not just a personality quirk, then.
Not at all. It's not a choice or a flaw. It explains a core biological need we all have for connection. I mean, humans are born utterly dependent. The drive to seek proximity to a caregiver is a survival imperative, plain and simple.
So the key to understanding our adult relationships is looking back.
It's recognizing how the quality of that early care forms what researchers call the internal working model. You can think of it as a relationship blueprint.
That blueprint sounds less like a flexible guide and more like a deeply entrenched operating system.
Well, it creates powerful predispositions because it was literally forged under conditions of survival. If that original care was consistently supportive, the system learns to stay calm.
But if it wasn't?
If the care was unpredictable or even absent, the brain had to develop these complex, sometimes very costly behavioral strategies, the attachment styles, just to cope with an environment it perceived as unsafe.
And that pattern just gets stamped onto everything else.
It guides all subsequent relationships, romantic, friendships, even professional ones. But, and this is the essential distinction, those later experiences are powerful enough to modify the blueprint. Understanding the specific mechanisms of these strategies is really the first step toward making any conscious change.
Okay, so let's start with the structure of that operating system. What are the four main programs running in the background, especially when the stress of intimacy or some perceived threat activates them?
Right, so we can detail the four main adult attachment types. And remember, these aren't static labels you put on people. They just describe the automatic reflexive program that runs when your attachment system gets activated, when you feel vulnerable or threatened or you need support.
So give us the baseline first. What does the optimized program, the secure one, look like?
So, secure attachment is the ideal state. It's what happens when the caretaking route was consistent, stable, and predictably responsive.
The caregiver was just there.
Exactly. When the child cried or needed comfort, the caregiver was reliably available and responded appropriately. This taught the child that the world is a fundamentally safe place and that they are worthy of help.
And how does that play out in adulthood?
The adult program that results is defined by its flexibility. Secure individuals are really adept at co-regulating their emotions with a partner. They're comfortable expressing their needs without this deep fear of rejection, and they're comfortable with both deep intimacy and healthy independence.
They can be close and they can be separate.
Yes, they have a high degree of confidence, resilience, and crucially, their capacity for what we call relationship repair. Navigating conflict, owning mistakes, and quickly restoring that closeness is very robust. They use the relationship as a secure base from which they can confidently go out and explore the world.
Okay, so that's the goal. Now we move into the insecure styles, where these strategies become, as you said, necessary adaptations.
Precisely. First up, there is the pattern that leads to the neediest adaptation, anxious or preoccupied attachment. The caretaking route here was characterized by unpredictably responsive care.
Meaning sometimes they got comfort, sometimes they didn't.
Right. The child's signal for security was often met, but inconsistently. It operated on what psychologists call a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement.
Which is the same principle that makes slot machines so addictive.
It's the exact same principle. If you think about it neurologically, this intermittent reward system creates the maximal drive to continue the behavior. The child, and later the adult, becomes hyper-focused on the relationship because the payoff is possible, but it's completely uncertain.
Their whole world revolves around getting that next hit of reassurance.
Their core fear is abandonment or rejection. So their strategy becomes hyperactivation. They escalate their distress signals. This manifests as that excessive focus on the partner, constantly seeking reassurance, often overgiving or fawning, and just this chronic state of hypersensitivity to any negative signal.
Like a delayed text message becomes a catastrophe.
It isn't a minor oversight to them. It's immediately processed as existential evidence that the entire relationship is failing. They're often perceived as clingy, but psychologically they're just engaging in a frantic search for the security they know is achievable but constantly feels like it's slipping away.
So that strategy is all about pulling the partner closer through intense focus.
Yeah.
What about my friend who had that powerful urge to push intimacy away?
So that is the hallmark of dismissive avoidant attachment. Their caretaking route was the opposite. It was predictably unresponsive, emotionally absent, or neglectful.
So the lesson wasn't try harder, it was don't even bother.
Exactly. The child learned that seeking comfort was futile. It's what we call an extinction schedule for security-seeking behavior. The child learns very quickly to just shut down that system.
And the adult program?
The adult program develops this core internalized belief that dependency is dangerous, emotions are messy, and seeking help is a weakness.
They learn self-reliance as a necessity, basically. It's a survival skill.
Their entire survival strategy is deactivation. This means they compulsively strive for this fierce self-sufficiency. They suppress and minimize their own internal emotional experience, and they use physical or emotional distancing, that urge to run, to ghost, to withdraw, as a primary method of regulating their own distress.
So closeness itself is the trigger.
For them, intimacy equates to vulnerability, which equates to a guaranteed path back to neglect and pain. So when a partner gets too close, their internal threat system screams, danger! You are about to become dependent, and you know how that ends. That fortress of independence feels like security to them.
And then we have the style that seems to combine both of these painful lessons.
That's the most complex and honestly often the most agonizing style. Fearful avoidant attachment, which is sometimes termed disorganized.
Why disorganized?
Because their caretaking route was chaotic, confusing, and unstable. It was characterized by this fundamental contradiction where the source of love and the source of harm were the same.
Like an abusive parent who is also sometimes affectionate.
Exactly that. Or just a caregiver with extreme emotional unpredictability. The child is simultaneously drawn to and terrified of their source of comfort.
So the adult program is just stuck.
It manifests as the central painful conflict, an intense desire for deep intimacy, that's the anxious pull, combined with an intense, paralyzing fear of being hurt or betrayed by it. That's the avoidant push.
The come here, go away dynamic.
It creates that famous push-pull pattern. They'll move close, they'll achieve vulnerability, but the internal danger alarm is so overwhelming that they suddenly withdraw. Or worse, they sabotage the connection just to regain control over the inevitable abandonment they're anticipating.
It's so clear that these blueprints aren't just abstract ideas. They're built on genuine survival mechanisms. That transition point you mentioned, the moment the alarm gets triggered, that's exactly what we need to focus on next. These psychological patterns are inseparable from a physiological state of alarm.
Absolutely. That is the core realization of modern attachment research. These are not merely personality concepts, they are fundamentally wired into the body's primary stress pathways. Early inconsistency and insecurity, they don't just shape our minds, they calibrate our nervous systems, creating that biological tripwire.
Okay, let's look at the physiological reality here.
Yeah.
We can use a case like Maya to hook this discussion. So imagine Maya is experiencing this neurobiological storm, a physical panic attack, simply because her partner missed a scheduled phone call.
Right.
She's not choosing to be dramatic or clingy. Her body is literally reacting as if her life is in peril.
This is immediate evidence of that primitive survival system completely overriding logic. When Maya's anxious attachment system is hyperactivated by that perceived threat of abandonment, her amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, it shouts so loudly that it effectively hijacks the prefrontal cortex,
Rational part of the brain.
the part responsible for logic, planning, and emotional regulation. Her system enters a full physiological fight-or-flight state, that rush of desperate texts she sends. That's her system's attempt to restore homeostasis, to regulate a profoundly dysregulated internal state through immediate external reassurance.
So what does this chronic state of alarm do to the body long term? We have to discuss the central mechanism here, the HPA axis and cortisol.
Right, the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, is our major endocrine stress response system. It's what controls the release of cortisol, our main stress hormone. And the research is unequivocal. Insecure attachment in childhood, defined by that failure to provide consistent security, is a major vulnerability factor for systemic health issues because it fundamentally alters the calibration of the stress system.
How does that altered calibration play out, specifically for the anxious style, for someone like Maya?
Well, for the anxious attachment style, consistent with their strategy of hyperactivation, studies show they exhibit a significant dysregulation of the HPA axis. They don't just show elevated cortisol in response to, say, a laboratory stressor. They also take significantly longer to recover back to baseline compared to securely attached individuals. Furthermore, research indicates they produce higher daily cortisol levels. This reflects that chronic, low-grade state of permanent alert or hypervigilance that defines how they engage with the world.
So if they are constantly producing cortisol, what's the long-term impact on their ability to regulate stress? Is the system just burning out?
This is where the technical detail is so crucial. Chronic cortisol exposure, driven by insecurity, can lead to a phenomenon called glucocorticoid resistance.
Meaning?
The stress receptors in the body and brain, they become less sensitive to cortisol. This means the system struggles to properly shut down the stress response, so it just keeps running.
And that has knock-on effects.
Huge ones. This chronic failure to regulate stress is directly linked to higher inflammation markers. For example, one clinical study found that high attachment anxiety was predictive of a greater increase in the inflammation marker IL-6 following major surgery.
Wow. So the emotional worry is translating directly into a weaker physical recovery.
Exactly. And this inflammatory response is thought to be mediated by the hypervigilance and the poor sleep quality that accompany constant worry. It's a direct pathway from psychological state to systemic physical breakdown.
That paints a really clear, if bleak, picture for the hyperactivated style. Now, let's look at the seemingly calm, cool, and collected avoidant individuals. How does their deactivation strategy manifest physiologically?
This is arguably the most revealing data set because it exposes that internal contradiction. Avoidant individuals use active deactivating strategies to suppress distress. So what the research shows is they have significantly elevated cortisol before an anticipated conflict discussion with a partner.
So they're not calm at all on the inside. They're bracing for impact.
They are highly stressed and anticipating a threat. But here's the kicker. This spike is followed by a very rapid, often sharp, drop in cortisol after they disengage or withdraw.
So the strategy of shutting down and pulling away isn't just an emotional relief. It's a measurable, powerful, physiological relief.
Exactly. Their defense mechanism is biologically functional, at least in the short term. The moment they physically or emotionally distance themselves, their internal alarm system stands down, which just confirms the avoidant blueprint. Proximity equals danger, isolation equals safety.
But this constant dysregulation, whether it's suppressed or hyperactivated, it must take a toll. And that's where this concept of allostasis comes in, right?
It does. Over the long term, this repeated or chronic mobilization of stress responses, which is necessary to achieve stability in the face of insecure attachment, it increases the body's allostatic load.
Which is basically the wear and tear on the body.
It's the cumulative wear and tear. Allostasis is just achieving stability through physiological change. When that system is constantly working overtime because of the inherent threat of insecurity, the damage accumulates, and we have compelling longitudinal data supporting this.
From childhood to adulthood.
Yes, a landmark study followed individuals from infancy into their mid-30s. It found that those classified as insecurely attached as infants were significantly more likely to experience an inflammation-related illness like heart disease, diabetes, or stroke as adults.
That's incredible.
And this was even after controlling for traditional risk factors like smoking or socioeconomic status. The stress of insecurity literally programs the body for chronic disease decades later.
That is profound.
Yeah.
It turns the psychological into the fundamentally biological. And we also see effects in the body's rapid response system, right? The sympathetic adrenal medullary system.
Correct. The SAM system that governs the acute rapid fight-or-flight response, the immediate release of adrenaline, rapid heart rate, heightened vigilance. Both childhood and adult insecurity are associated with heightened SAM reactivity.
Okay.
But a particularly striking finding for both anxious and avoidant insecurity is the disjunction between their internal experience and their outward report.
The discrepancy between what they feel and what they admit to feeling.
Yes. Insecure individuals often show a major discrepancy between their high physiological stress reaction, their racing heart, their high cortisol, and their subjective report of distress. They might report feeling only mildly bothered, even while their body is screaming threat.
So they're out of touch with their own bodies.
It points to a heavy reliance on defensive or dissociated affect regulation, which is basically emotional suppression. And while suppression is a functional coping mechanism to manage intense internal conflict, relying on it is in itself linked to increased cardiovascular reactivity and poorer long-term health outcomes. The avoidant person's proclaimed calm is often a very high-cost defense, not true tranquility.
And finally, I have to assume that when you mix these volatile blueprints in a relationship, the physiological stress only compounds.
The dyadic context is exceptionally important. Research confirms that when highly anxious individuals pair with highly avoidant individuals, they create this high-stress feedback loop, and the physiological impact is measurable.
You can actually see it in their cortisol levels.
One study on married couples found that the pairing of highly anxious wives with highly avoidant husbands showed the sharpest cortisol increases in anticipation of a conflict discussion, and the behavioral analysis was just as revealing. The anxious partner's hyperactivation made it hard for them to effectively perceive the avoidant partner's subtle internal distress signals, and the avoidant partner's deactivating strategies made it nearly impossible for them to convey their needs constructively. The insecure strategies just feed off each other, confirming the worst fears of both parties and biologically validating their high-stress existence.
So if these biological tripwires are set so early and the stress is so high, we have to acknowledge that we don't live in a vacuum. The individual stress response, it has to be validated or invalidated by the world around them. And here's where it gets really interesting. How do societal norms and culture either reinforce or modify these patterns, making one type of insecurity more common in one place than another?
This is the shift from microdynamics to macrodynamics. And we can think of culture not just as a set of traditions, but as a massive, enduring reinforcement schedule.
A reinforcement schedule for certain attachment styles.
Yes. Attachment patterns become an emergent property of the differential distribution of insecure types within a society, driven by what that society fundamentally rewards and values.
So let's use the example of Kenji. He is dismissive avoidant, and he uses his demanding, high-status career, that relentless hustle, as a fortress against intimacy. His society tells him that his self-reliance and emotional distance are virtues.
That case perfectly illustrates the dynamic in individualist societies, typically found in Western countries, including the U.S. These cultures are characterized by strong rule of law and, crucially, a relatively low risk in establishing weak-tie relationships.
Weak-tie meaning?
Relationships with strangers or new business contacts. The culture values autonomy and the ability to move freely across social boundaries.
And that maps onto an avoidance style.
It does. These societies reflect a statistically higher representation of insecure avoidant attachments. They cultivate what's called bridging social capital, the ability to connect with diverse groups, seek novelty, and innovate outside the family unit. And the historical trajectory of modern individualism often necessitates a certain emotional distance.
And the parenting matches that.
Furthermore, the caretaking practices frequently align with this avoidance. Practices like bottle feeding, scheduling feeding times rigidly, and high maternal workforce participation are statistically associated with higher rates of avoidant attachment in infants.
Because these practices can reflect a predictably unresponsive schedule for comfort seeking.
Precisely. The child learns that independence is the functional path. And critically, caretakers in individualist cultures often interpret a child's avoidant behavior. They're self-soothing, their quiet play positively. They describe them as independent, mature, or good sleepers.
So the culture literally rewards the defense mechanism.
It reinforces the exact emotional defense the child developed, making avoidance feel like an effective, socially validated survival strategy.
Okay, now let's pivot to the opposite dynamic, the collectivist societies.
Collectivist societies, often found in East Asia, are historically characterized by a weaker rule of law outside the established community, and thus a high social risk outside of strong tie relationships.
So survival depended on the group.
Historically, it necessitated intense, often inflexible, reliance on the group and the immediate family structure. These societies reflect an overrepresentation of insecure, anxious attachments. They cultivate bonding, social, capital-intense security seeking within that strong network.
So the anxiety of abandonment is heightened because abandonment doesn't just mean emotional distress, it means losing your entire safety net.
Yes, exactly. And the caretaking practices often introduce variability into parental responsiveness, which induces that classic anxious pattern of unpredictably responsive or intermittent reinforcement.
How so?
We see this historically in cultural practices designed to keep the child highly attuned to the parent. Consider the Balinese borrowed baby game. A mother might momentarily borrow a neighbor's infant to tease her own child, eliciting a distress response from her own child before finally returning to console him.
That sounds like active training for hypervigilance.
It is. This conditioned high attention on the parent, the sign of safety, is what researchers call sign tracking. The child is conditioned to focus their attention obsessively on the sign, which is the caregiver, rather than the immediate comfort, the reward.
Which is the exact opposite of the independent child in the West.
Right. This hyper-attentional focus is consistent with the tenets of collectivism, where personal success and safety rely on attending to and constantly managing those strong tie relationships. Both insecure patterns, whether anxious or avoidant, become functionally adaptive tools for navigating their respective cultural demands.
We mentioned earlier that universal shift where the romantic partner becomes the primary source of adult attachment. Does culture still moderate the extent of that reliance?
It absolutely does. The transfer of attachment functions from parents to partners is a universal human trend. However, when you compare individualist, say US, and collectivist, say Korean, cultures, the density and the distribution of that attachment network differ significantly.
How so?
U.S. participants rely on their romantic partner more frequently than Korean participants across core attachment functions, like proximity seeking, using the partner as a safe haven, seeking advice.
So the individualist culture tends to funnel everything onto that single romantic partnership.
Precisely. The partner is often expected to be the all-encompassing secure base, the one-stop shop for all attachment needs. In contrast, Korean participants are more likely to distribute certain attachment functions across their immediate family network, specifically relying on their mother and even their child for certain types of relational support compared to U.S. participants. Culture dictates not just how you attach, but to whom you attach.
The story we've traced is one of deep conditioning, biological wiring cemented by cultural reward structures. For someone listening who recognizes their own hyperactivation or deactivation strategies in this discussion, the prospect of reversing this sounds incredibly difficult.
This brings us to the most hopeful and evidence-based part of this deep dive, the profound capacity for emotional and neurological repair. And this is encapsulated in the concept of earned security.
Earned security.
Yes. This data directly challenges those earlier notions that attachment styles are fixed by age 5. Earned security is the triumph of conscious, intentional effort over early, often painful, conditioning. It proves that neuroplasticity is real.
So how exactly is earned security defined in clinical research?
ES is attained when an individual moves from an insecure attachment stance, anxious, avoidant, or fearful avoidant, to a secure one through significant corrective and healing experiences.
And what's the key psychological marker?
It's the ability to achieve a calm, logical, and coherent reflection on a difficult or unstable childhood. They're able to acknowledge the pain and challenge of their past without minimizing it, without resentment, and without excessive emotional display. They've processed it and integrated it into their self-narrative.
So it's not just a behavioral shift where they act secure, it's a cognitive and emotional shift where they genuinely feel secure, even when they're discussing the source of their initial insecurity.
Exactly. We have defined research on what we call the ES profile, and it truly underscores the triumph of resilience. ES individuals report that their parents were objectively more neglecting, rejecting, and less loving than individuals who were continuously secure from infancy.
Their starting point was much worse.
Much worse. In fact, one study found that a staggering 56% of ES participants reported experiencing or witnessing major loss, abuse, or trauma during childhood, compared to only 29% of the continuous secure group.
So their security was earned through processing hardship, not just granted by early stability.
That's the distinction. And crucially, the data shows that 68% of ES individuals reported they had a lot of challenges during childhood but have since actively worked through them, versus less than a third of the CS group. Their ability to reflect on and process their past coherently, what researchers call metacognitive monitoring, that is the defining feature of earned security. They did the hard work of making meaning out of chaos.
And what role do new intimate relationships play in providing this necessary corrective experience?
ES is overwhelmingly attained through participation in corrective relationships that actively disconfirm the old negative mental models.
So they basically rewrite the code.
They do. If the avoidance hidden software says vulnerability leads to guaranteed pain, the new relationship has to systematically prove over hundreds of interactions that vulnerability leads to guaranteed safety and support.
Does it have to be a romantic partner?
Studies show that non-family members, mentors, friends, or partners are just as likely as family members to serve as the source of this reparative experience.
But the romantic partner seems to be a particularly powerful agent of change, maybe because the stakes are so high there.
The partner is consistently cited as the single most effective source of repair. Research shows that for ES individuals, the partner was the most frequently reported current most important relationship, accounting for 40% of the cases studied. This suggests that the intense emotional proximity inherent in a romantic bond, when it's stable and secure, provides the most potent antidote to insecurity.
Okay, let's dedicate some time to the specific qualities that make these relationships corrective. For the person who has been anxiously craving inconsistent attention, or the person who runs from closeness, what does the new secure working model need to deliver?
We can analyze the specific reparative qualities reported by ES individuals in their current most important relationship, and these qualities directly dismantle those anxious or avoidant defenses.
So start with the most frequently cited quality.
That is love, defined specifically as unconditional and affectionate. For the anxious individual, unconditional love breaks that pattern of intermittent reinforcement. They learn their worth isn't tied to performance or their hyper-vigilant efforts to please.
And for the avoidant?
For the avoidant individual, unconditional love is a constant disconfirmation of their core belief that dependency is dangerous. If they are loved even when they are vulnerable, they learn that the risk of intimacy is lower than the risk of isolation.
Okay, and the second quality? Acceptance.
Acceptance, described as understanding, patient, and non-judgmental, is the cornerstone of emotional safety. For the anxious individual, acceptance means their distress signals are met with patience, not irritation, which slowly regulates their hyperactive system.
And for the avoidant, it must be huge to be accepted when they show weakness.
It allows them to tentatively lower their defensive walls. They can show weakness or express a messy emotion without fear of immediate criticism or being told to just handle it, which was likely their childhood norm.
And finally, trust, which I imagine is about consistency and stability.
Trust, characterized as dependability and radical consistency, is perhaps the most important therapeutic agent for both styles. For the anxious style, consistency, the predictable response, the follow-through, the reliable presence. It shuts down the slot machine behavior. It tells the system, you don't need to hyperactivate, the security is already here.
And for the avoidant, it proves the other person won't disappear.
It combats their historical experience of emotional extinction. They learn that the relationship won't vanish when they are most dependent, which allows them to finally internalize that reliance is safe. These three qualities, unconditional love, non-judgmental acceptance, and radical consistency, are the building blocks that literally construct the new, secure internal software.
Let's bring this into a clinical context to show what this intense relational rewiring looks like in practice, particularly for the most volatile attachment style, the fearful avoidant.
Okay, we can use the example of a client. Let's call her Alina. She was stuck in that fearful avoidant push-pull cycle. She desperately wanted closeness. But the moment her partner showed commitment, she would preemptively sabotage the relationship, often through hostility, just to manage her overwhelming terror of being hurt. Her breakthrough occurred in emotionally focused therapy, or EFT, which is designed specifically to access and reorganize the emotional responses that are tied to attachment.
So the therapist's goal here isn't to fix her behavior, but to get beneath that protective anger she's showing.
Exactly. For the fearful avoidance style, the goal is not to suppress the fear or the anger, those are secondary defenses, but to safely access the primary underlying emotion. The therapist helped Elena connect her outer hostility, her pushing away or her coldness, to her primary emotion, which was sheer terror rooted in her chaotic childhood. She was pushing her partner away to avoid the anticipated pain she learned to expect from intimacy.
That moment must be agonizing, facing that pure terror.
It is the emotional crucible of change. The moment of breakthrough came when Elena was finally able to articulate that inner conflict, not to the therapist, but directly to her partner, while the therapist held that emotional container. She looked at him, and she admitted, through overwhelming tears, the full weight of her hidden software. She said, "I am pushing you away because I am waiting for you to hurt me. I can't stop waiting for you to leave."
Wow. That raw, honest vulnerability, acknowledging the fear rather than acting out the defense, that's massive.
And that vulnerability, when it's met by a non-retaliating, calm, and accepting partner, that is the definition of a corrective experience. The partner didn't get angry at the hostility, he didn't run from her terror, he stayed and responded with those key reparative qualities: acceptance, love, and consistency.
So her brain gets new data in real time.
In that moment, Elena's brain, operating under the full weight of her biological stress, registered that proximity did not equal danger. And this experience, repeated consistently, systematically rewires her expectations, moving her from that operating system dangerous to the new secure setting, safe.
So what does this all mean for us as we conclude this deep dive? We've traced the mechanism from childhood inconsistency, cemented by neurological panic alarms that drive cortisol spikes and hypervigilance, and then reinforced by these huge cultural scripts that reward either tight bonds or fierce independence.
It means that while our behavioral predispositions established early on, whether it's the hyperactivation of anxiety or the deactivating pull of avoidance, were incredibly powerful, functional, and I'd say necessary strategies forged for survival in a complex environment, they are not our final destination. The capacity for own security demonstrates that even with a challenging foundation, humans are fundamentally adaptive systems. We're capable of systematic, conscious, and relational repair.
We're not permanently defined by the earliest version of our hidden software.
Not at all. We have the agency to update the operating system and to choose the path of security.